we're going to start the live cast as well. Perfect. All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Rewards Mastermind. So we're going to have a really important topic today. We're going to talk about remote work and pay policies and the top 5 things that you need to know and what to do next in your organization. And so we're going to talk about our special guest today. But overall, I just want to give you a little bit of knowledge about what the Rewards Mastermind is all about. And so basically, we are a group of professionals. We bring in people from the industry. We talk about different rewards topics and how we can elevate the practice overall, making sure that we're all in the know about the new trends and important topics that are coming out. And so in addition to our special guest that we have today, I want to make sure that we introduce, in addition to myself, we have Howard Niswitz and Jackson Brockway. And now just about our guest. Oh, here we go. Our guest is David Livitt. He's a founder of Livitt and Associates. It's a global mobility and tax consultancy. And we're going to be talking about the mobile workforce specialization today, about the tax and elements that are around that. David is not just an expert; he's a visionary about navigating the intricacies of the global mobile workforce. And so he has a deep expertise in compliance management and strategic policy design that has made him a trusted advisor in the multinational businesses and individuals alike overall. And so, as we know in today's world, where remote work is not just a trend, but a facet of the business strategy, David's insights are more relevant than ever. And so that's why we're bringing this up on the call today. So his approach to aligning mobility programs with corporate branding and integrating cutting edge technology, ensuring seamless operations of global mobility is going to be quite important for the future. So let's go ahead and dive into the topic. First, I want to make sure that we hear a little bit about David's past and his story about how he got to where he is today and the clients he serves. So David, could you enlighten us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sam. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I was thinking about this earlier on. I think I entered into the global mobility tax world last century, which sounds really scary when I think about it. So it was, it was with Arthur Anderson many years ago, for those who remember that firm. And I've spent the last sort of 24 years or so specializing in helping companies with their mobile workforce. And it really started out as just those expats, typically long term, between 2 to 3 years from location A to location B, became business travelers. And then the last sort of 4 or 5 years, it just exploded, expanded. It's the entire workforce now. And where I've always sort of focused on, and what I've really narrowed down to, is that the complexity of how to manage all those different variables, but who's mobile, who isn't, all the different areas of risk and compliance that need to be managed. And I've worked with clients from huge multinationals right the way down to startups, really sort of helping scale their policy and processes to manage the tax, technical, social security, reward, all those sort of aspects as well. So I find it hugely challenging and very rewarding at the same time.
But overall, I mean, how did you get into this line of work, David? I mean, it just is. Did you always have an interest in international business yourself, or?
That's a really good question. I ventured into it through international HR. Prior to joining Arthur Anderson, I was in that sort of space. Prior to that, I studied. We were just talking about it. Archaeology. So very odd entry. And I think most tax people are probably, certainly from the UK, sort of fall into it almost by accident. But what I found particularly interesting about this area and the sort of mobility aspects of it is you're dealing with the corporate, so there's the corporate sort of body to be aware of, how to protect their risk and their operations. But you get to meet the individuals as well at the other end, the actual employees, and I found that balance to be hugely, it's just great fun. You meet some characters along the way.
Yeah, I remember when I was at Barclays, I worked with a lot of your colleagues at PwC at that time, and just
Right.
and there the game was different, as you mentioned. You alluded to. I mean, we had like executives and senior level professionals that were moving around the globe, and they had different compensation packages that had tax impacts and so forth. But how has that world changed to what we're dealing with now? You're saying that now it's a lot broader, but what are the issues that companies are dealing with now with global mobility?
Yeah, great question. I might just take a step back first because I think there's some elements to sort of frame that question. Just some numbers, just a very quick update. So pre-pandemic, about 5% of a workforce. This was from surveys that I've been looking at for the last couple of years from a variety of sort of global mobility sort of providers as such. And on average, about 5% of the workforce was mobile pre-pandemic. And certainly within that, a very small number were remote. That leapt to 60%, 55, 60% during the pandemic. And now it's sort of a downward trend, but sort of plateauing at about sort of 30, 35%. So what does that mean? Well, it's, to your point, it was a lot easier in the olden days when you had a defined group of employees who were mobile, and as a result, you could define what their risk and compliance that they created as a group, because it was typically someone going for 2 to 3 years, or it was a business traveler. So, and we'll come on to those sort of some of the complexities in a while. But now it could be anyone, right? It could be the entire workforce that could, whether they're hybrid workers in an office 2 to 3 days a week. It's a remote worker who is permanently remote in a location, or somebody who's going on vacation. They're on a business trip and they want to tag on another month to work in Rio on the beach or whatever. There's all these sort of scenarios now which have really transformed the working world. And some of those the messaging that companies are sort of giving out internally about what their workforce can do, but it's added the complexity of added risk and compliance to HR, legal, reward, payroll. It's the whole sort of all those sort of internal operational aspects of the business. And I think that's where what I'm seeing now in the last couple of years is just growing awareness of the issues. Some companies taking action. There's some other great stats, and I'll read you some more. There's the OECD basically said that only 40% of companies globally, I don't know how many they surveyed, this was just a sort of snapshot, have a policy around working remotely. So if you're suddenly allowing your workforce to work anywhere, how are you managing where they are and what they're doing, and what that creates for you, those risks? And within that, only 65%, sorry, I got the wrong way around, only 35% are tracking where they're going. So they might have a policy to say, you can go and work remotely in Rio, but they're not actually monitoring how long they're there for and when they get back. So that, without trying to create too much fear, it's very much around what are the actions around that, how to manage that risk, what's your risk tolerance, and what steps can you take?
I was going to say, how do companies even keep track with employees moving around as frequently as they do now? They can be bouncing all over the place between, the States, overseas, back to the States. It seems like a whole task.
It's if we sidetrack a little bit into that data, because that's where this all starts. It's where do you get the data from? I mean, we're all sitting. I mean, Jackson, you've got a screen behind you. You could be anywhere. I'm assuming you're in the US, right? I'm guessing, just because right, there you go. But you might not be, and I appreciate you probably just said that because Sam and Howard are on the phone. so that you're not trying to
I
hide
use the
somewhere.
same background every day, so they'd never know.
Right, exactly. Right.
He tells us he's in Alaska, but who knows?
So there's a little bit around the data sources are really important. But if you're just a regular employee, how much information do you want to give your employer of where you are? I mean, what's the boundary? So typically, business or historically, business travel data was where you grabbed a lot of that information from, because there may have been a centralized booking procedure or expenses that said I was eating at Pizza Express or Pizza Hut or something like that. Those sorts of things. So that's one element. But when you're a remote worker, you're not necessarily on performing in that location because of your business has required you to do it. There's no expense to claim. So companies have looked at various things like calendars. Some have looked at IP addresses, tracking those GPS signals. I'm already seeing some of the, and that's exactly the issue. So then you get
Big brother.
Exactly, and this is where, even within the US, which is slightly more relaxed in some of its rules, the rules are state to state. Some allow a little bit more leniency for employee location tracking than others. But once you get international, certainly in some countries, Germany has been a great example, where that tracking of your employee is just an absolute no-no. I mean, it's just not acceptable, and it could open up sort of lawsuits. So my advice there would be check your data sources and look to be more proactive in actually asking permission, explaining. This is where we come on to the sort of 5 actions. That communications piece around your policy, why you're doing it, why it's necessary, and then looking at maybe a calendar function or self-check-in. What does your HRIS system allow you to do already? If you're using something like Workday, for example, or Oracle, or one of those, can you check in to say where you are? Some companies look for it as a sort of an annual approach. So they'll just say every about this time of year, October, November, tell us where you've been working. We'll do an annual sort of review. That doesn't always answer the risk up front, but at least it's doing something. And just I'll leave you on the last bit for the next question. Was some actually have adopted a pre-approval process. So that's where how you put a request in to somebody or some people. Can I go and work remotely in India for 4 months? Well, no, for example, or we need to double check that. So then you get into the whole area of what does that pre-approval process look like? But the data piece is really, really tough.
Crazy. At what point, let's say we just focus on the United States. At what point is the employer liable for paying taxes in the various states? Is it a month?
Only you see, Howard, you'd think that that would be a fairly straightforward answer, and we've only got an hour, so it's not, unfortunately. So, of all the states that tax, and let's just talk about income tax for one moment on employment income, because that's going to be the main focus. The rules for each state vary, and they could be dependent on the number of days you spend in that state, or the amount of income that's attributed to your work days in that state, or a combination of both. And so you really, that's where payroll systems, you're probably looking at a bit more sophistication around some of the payroll systems, just to be able to manage the reporting between some of those states. Some states offer, Indiana, Montana now have 30-day limits. They're the most sort of recent two. So you're into the sort of day tracking up front, which can be, again, troublesome because of the very nature of what that looks like. I think in the US, you tend to find it's a little bit more straightforward from an annual perspective. It's not quite right because of all the payroll reporting forms, but if you're doing something annually to catch, all the different states that require non-residents to report their employment income, and you do some sort of year-end review and create the W-2, that's probably a good enough piece for compliance. The challenge you have then, of course, is that you've got to, it's the communication to the workforce around why they're suddenly getting more than one state W-2. I'm going to kind of layer on some complexities around that as well, because there's I'm sure you're aware of them. Then you get into the some of the employer of convenience rules as well. So just because you may be working in another state doesn't mean to say your home state doesn't want to tax the same income. And if you're employed by certain companies in a certain state, so New York's always the classic example. So you have you're a New York business, and you've hired someone remotely on a New York contract, and they're in. I wanted to choose New Jersey, but that's going through its own. They're going through their own little tussle at the moment. But you're working in another state where just by convenience you're working remotely. So it's just because you happen to, it's just very easy for you not to get into the city on that particular day, week, whatever. New York will still say you owe them money, even though you're a resident of the other state. So that's very high level. But there's other rules around the state you're in, working in as a non-resident remotely on a temporary basis that you just need to be aware of. At a broader corporate level, there's nexus, there's sales tax, there's other sort of aspects there as well.
So maybe we should, there's a lot of good information. We can go in a lot of detail here, but
Yeah.
let's just back up into the 5 things that that companies need to know overall.
Yeah, I think the very first thing I've always sort of advised on is to really do an audit of where you are right now. And that is and it goes to Howard's point, who's mobile? Where are our people? What are they doing? How long are they there for? Are they remote hires into places? Are they just temporarily remote? How can we get that data? That could be through a survey. It could be through internal back office kind of means, but again, communicate that. And I think so once you've got that data and you've done that audit, it's to pull together all the departments within your business. And again, this is businesses of all sizes. It might be, someone might have 2 or 3 roles I get in one, some smaller businesses maybe than some of the larger ones, but certainly to pull together some of the heads of, payroll, HR, legal, corporate tax. Maybe you might have a travel manager as well, a travel department, time and expense, all those sorts of areas. Pull that group together and say, look, we have a workforce that are everywhere potentially. How do we manage what is our risk in these areas? What do we need to communicate, and how do we manage that? So I think that's the first piece, is to identify data and ownership is really the 2 big things there. The second point is really around, the policy, the communications piece. So what do you want to do as a business? And this is where, again, there's no hard and fast rules. And I've seen all sorts of communications. Some have said, work wherever you want. Up to 10 days, we don't care. It's that sort of thing. Others have been very strict to say, you can only work in these locations where we have an entity. So it might be states or countries, and you can only spend up to 30 days, 45 days, whatever, in those other, cumulatively over a 12-month period in another place. It may be that you can only work in a jurisdiction that has an agreement, like a tax treaty or a reciprocal agreement with your home location. So again, you can really narrow down your policy and put some real framework and be quite sort of rigid, I guess, around that, to those that are a bit more just be sensible and, but we'll limit it in different ways. Communication is the key to that. So you have a policy document. Doesn't need to be very long. It can be country or regional, global, depending on how you want to word that. And then on the back of that, the communication piece is really important. How do you convey that to different, if in the US, you're probably looking at a fairly homogenous group, but if you're into different languages and different cultures, how does that look and feel? So make sure that's working. And the last bit that I would say around that sort of policy piece is having an FAQ, frequently asked questions. It's amazing how many people try and game the system. You know, you always got, there's some very bright people and they're always going to ask you questions that you've not heard or thought of. So having that sort of live document, you can then manage the volume hitting the people that need to make decisions, because there's a filter through the policy and communication piece. So that's point two. Point three is, and this comes out of the working group, the process around that. Do you want a pre-approval process so that every employee has to request to work remotely? You know, that might be easy in a business that's maybe 100 people, but when you're talking to 5,000, 10,000, that's a full-time job. And you can imagine the seasonal fluctuations in that as well. That's quite a lot. So I think there's a bit around what you want that process to look like, who needs to approve it, and then how you're tracking the days that person is working remotely. You know, is it something that they have to do themselves and report back? Is it something a little bit more sort of proactive from the company side? And we'll bounce to that in a moment. The process bit, to me, has always been the big challenge, just because of all the different departments it touches. And it doesn't mean to say it's not insurmountable as a problem. And you just want to look at the different layers of approval. And once you've got that policy in place, then it sort of filters, you know, fewer. So the real challenging ones, because of, you know, understandable circumstances like, you know, family illness or, you know, some other reason they want to work remotely for a period of time. Their special cases are the ones that really are discussed, as opposed to every case being discussed. So I think the process piece is important. Just to give you some ideas of times around that, the change management piece internally can be 12 months, can be 18 months. Just it's sort of muscle memory to remind people to, you know, if you allow people to work remotely, that they've got to report back. So that's the third area, process. The fourth area is technology. I get asked this question loads. You know, should we buy a big technology or you know, use it as a software as a service? And I think this is a separate work stream. Once you've identified your risk, what you need to do is, do you need a technology? And again, some are scalable. If it's a smaller business, you might not need to do that. Other larger ones, some in the sort of automotive and engineering, because their engineers are, you know, not only just business travelers, but they might be, you know, hired remotely and working remotely. It's easy to track through a dedicated technology, and there's various options out there, again, that will help manage the approval process and the tracking and dashboard reporting. That's sort of one end versus good old spreadsheet. So it really depends, and I think that's where having an idea of your risk to begin with, and the scale, the quantity of the problem, will drive what you need to help solve that, as well as your own resources, of course. And then the last area is compliance. That favorite for a tax professional is, you know, what's at the end of all this. And I split that into sort of two buckets, really. It's corporate compliance and then the individual compliance. From a corporate standpoint, again, you're looking at, Howard mentioned, the sort of state-to-state reporting requirements. Most companies are ensuring that they are operating the payroll to correctly report anyone remote working or temporarily remote, if they've been temporarily remote in a state, to get that apportionment of income correct for that reporting. So that's the sort of I guess table stakes for the companies, to make sure that the payroll aspects are correct. Now that sounds great, but then if you've had not great data in, then you're not going to have great data out. So understanding what needs to be reported in that other tax jurisdiction, yeah, salary, compensation, benefits, pension, commission, bonuses, and then onto some of the longer term incentive plans, RSUs, stock options, you know, all those sorts of things. It means that that person may have finding requirements a little bit longer than maybe they had thought by working remotely on a temporary or permanent basis in that other jurisdiction. Most companies stop at that point because then they think you wanted to work remotely. You know, or you're in that other location permanently. That's on you. You know, you're then responsible for filing. Not everyone, but most companies are sort of taking that position that it's down to you. It's for your, you know, the individual employee's pocket. They might recommend people to help with compliance, but anything to do with that in terms of the double reporting, the credits that might be available, that's all on the individual. So those are those sort of 5 areas. So it's basically the working group and the audit to begin with, policy, process, do you need a technology, and then what's the compliance risk and who's looking after it. So that's the sort of five areas I tend to look at.
You know,
Oh, go ahead, Jackson.
I was gonna say, you mentioned a lot about the FAQs and how some employees are trying to game the system depending on the established policy. Is that something that you see often where employees are pushing back on the established policy, saying you can only work in a few countries, or are generally people pretty happy to have the opportunity to work anywhere but the office?
What a great question. I think it was, again, if we just sort of take the recent history, it was quite interesting initially how a number of predominantly tech companies just said work from home, and they wanted to encourage that sort of way of working, the new way, the new norm, which I'm sure we've had new normals for the last 20 years. But anyway, but there's that whole sort of working out of at home. I think it's changing quite a bit, and it depends very much on the sector that you're working in. It's a lot easier in the service industry to work out of home. But I mean, I think you've probably read the press. I think it was even like 2 weeks ago. I think it was New York Times asking their staff to come back into the office, and there were protests outside. And so I think there is this sort of shift in being 100% remote and basically working wherever you want, to kind of companies going, actually, we do need to manage our risk because we want you to be back in the office for a variety of reasons. You might agree with or why not, but equally, we need to know where you are and what you're doing. I'm conscious I didn't really touch on the risks, because it's very easy for someone to say, well, there's all these risks, and what are they? And it's like, is it just me being a sort of doom monger kind of thing? The biggest risks for the company are really around lack of the inappropriate or the payroll operation isn't working correctly. I've forgotten the words going out of my mind, but the payroll operation isn't accurate. So if there's an audit by a state or a country, then that typically they'll be asking for data around who's in the country, where they're working, have they come in from overseas or a different state, and is your payroll operation correct? And then they'll drill into numbers for tax and social security. Maybe in the States, there've been some other payroll taxes for state unemployment, those sorts of things as well. So there's the risk is both a reputational and a financial risk for the business. For the individual, again, it's probably more the individual audit. If it's cross-border, the individual should be aware that immigration agencies are sharing data with the tax authorities in certain countries. So again, that means that they may approach the employer to say, hey, we know people are coming in because we've got the data to prove it, or they're stopping those individuals actually at the border. I've had various scenarios of senior C-suite level individuals using the same airports, smaller airports, because of it's private jets or company jets or whatever, and the border guys going, hey, I've seen you so many times, what are you doing here, and how much and they're actually more at risk than some of the other business remote workers, business travelers or whatever. So So I think it's just to know again where people are, what they're doing, how long they're there for, and having some sort of framework around that. You don't need to do it all, but doing nothing, I don't think is an option either.
Are there fines for companies that aren't reporting correctly?
Yeah, so it'll be more through sort of penalties for not filing and making payments, or interest, late filings. As of yet, I've not seen any specific remote work fine that's just sort of like labeled as such. It's more the operation of X you haven't done that, and therefore it's the fines. I mean, some of the ones I've seen over the years have been New York State in particular is quite aggressive in this space. They want to know who's in New York. After 14 days, you have withholding or taxable from day one. So they'll ask companies who's come in from out of state to work, and they need to report back. They've got to have a tracking system in play. And one particular client, probably about 5-6 years ago, didn't have that. They were what, 20,000 employer in New York, didn't have that process in place, had an audit, had to pay a fine of $1 million. They settled on a fine of $1 million for that particular tax year. The agent came in next day, opened up an audit for the next tax year, and went, another $1 million, please. So again, it's like that's risk. That's where, in the grand scheme of things, it might not be huge for a company. It's probably within the margins of error, but it's reputational, and it's individual employee risk, which is the duty of care aspects, which I think are greater here.
What about for just thinking about a lot of small employers? I mean, there's startups that have messaged that, hey, you can work from anywhere. Come work for us. There's been the global no-ban trend, of companies allowing people to, just go wherever. And so, as a small employer, what are the steps that they should take to kind of shore up and reduce risk?
Yeah, great question. The sort of digital nomads, the digital visas, and all these sorts of countries my advice there is they do work. There's no doubt about it, but read the small print. Typically, it's an immigration sort of break, in the sense of you don't need to get a visa, or you can be in a location for a certain amount of time. It doesn't necessarily, and it really depends on the countries you're going to, or the islands, certainly in the Caribbean, where this is quite popular. I think Estonia has one. I think Spain's just looking at this sort of remote work visa. And for some reason, I think New Zealand, but I might have that wrong. But it's the devil's in the detail, because it doesn't always flow through that the entity and the individual working there is exempt from reporting, registration, paying tax, and paying social taxes. So you really have to look at each country in isolation. Again, this is where, even for a small business, because it can be quite a minefield. I mean, that's quite a lot of work. Even with 10 people perhaps bouncing around because they don't need immigration clearance, well, you could have 10 countries at risk just from. So there are, again, sort of good technologies out there which will just give an indication of the corporate risk. They're specifically around digital nomads, and it will be you're looking at the corporate risk, payroll, social security, reporting, and yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't potentially plan your working year, to be in locations where you perhaps don't have any exposure. I mean, potentially. I know one guy. There was one newspaper article, was it last year, who lived on a cruise ship for a year. He just decided that he was just going to go from port to port. That does create some issues depending on if he left the ship. But on the whole, it's how are you going to track that? Who's going to know? It's that sort of thing. But those are very popular. The other big trend coming through, and has been for probably the last year, in the war on talent is hiring remotely now. So it used to be that, you know, if you were going to be hired, let's choose New York again, just for the sake of argument, into a New York business, they would get you to move it over into the tri-state area. You'd work out of the Manhattan office. Nowadays, I think most of us are like, no, creature comforts. My house is here, family, schools, you know, everything like that is embedded. So you're doing the job remotely. It might look easy to manage, but you may need to look at permanent establishment risk. You know, does that create an entity? How do you operate payroll, taxes, and social security in that person's location as a remote employee, as a remote hire? And ultimately, what are their roles and responsibilities, and how is that impacting the country they're employed out of? And what do they need to do from corporate tax deductions and transfer pricing potentially, and all these other sort of aspects? So there's nothing's easy. I would say the good news, there's always some good news, Sam. I've got to give some good news because it sounds like I'm giving terrible news all the way through this. Is tax authorities at a domestic level are aware of this. We're typically dealing with tax legislation that's been written 30, 40 years ago, where we didn't even have mobile phones, right? So now they're realizing they've got to, you know, adapt with the times. So there's within the states, there's legislation around telecommuting for certain states and days spent, as we were discussing, and thresholds, and there's reciprocal agreements. Then you go internationally and you've got tax treaties and social security agreements. And then the other good bit of news is that the UN Tax Committee, which must be an absolute riot to be on, is discussing a new Article 15 within the tax treaty model to basically sort of start the discussion around remote working and who has taxing rights and where reporting should be. They met last month. It's an interesting 15.4, I think it is, Article 15.4 is the actual wording there, which we could go into another time if you wanted, but it's very much saying it's on either or. It's not very clear, but they're meeting again in March, and let's get some more clarity around that, because I think that will help companies and individuals know exactly what they, you know, once countries have had that discussion, what they can do. So there's good news on the horizon, I think.
So, and generally in talking, you were mentioning about creating a policy and so forth. I mean, what are the elements that policy should include? I mean, is there, for instance, I mean, should it have certain countries that are okay, certain countries that are in time limits? And what does it look like?
That's a good question. I think when I've been working with clients on their policies, it's first of all to see what they have in place already. Some companies have already, you know, may have paragraphs in different policies that can need to be reviewed. Typically, I start off with you know, what's the purpose of the policy? So it's very clear, you know, what the policy is for. This is for a remote working guidance for temporary and permanent. Who owns it? How long it's in place? You know, this is for the next. Yeah, this is version 1. It will be reviewed in. So people are very clear at what it's sort of the framing at the top. Then I would go into, if you're domestic, remote worker, temporary, what that looks like. You know, what are you allowed to do? So if you're a domestic, so let's say you're in the UK, you're in England. Just keep it really simple. You're in England, and your main office is London, but you're living in, you know, sort of 100 miles away. You're permanently remote as a domestic. This is what your position is. If you want to go to Scotland or Wales, let's say you want to go to Wales, just take an argument, keep that simple. Then again, that's temporary. You want to go there for 20 days, that's fine. So you can again specify domestic, how many days they can be away from their home, their home base. I would call it a tax home, but just from an HR perspective, you might want different wording. So I think domestic is relatively straightforward. It gets a bit more complicated within the US or any sort of federal system where you have different states. But if within the US, you can say, if you can be in another state working for X days, and again, depends. I would say most companies are typically looking at about 30 days in another location cumulatively across a 12-month period. Within that perspective, when you start getting into then it's the international piece. Again, temporary, permanent. Temporary is that, can I tag a week on? I'm got a business trip to London and I'd like to stay another week on, see people in the office or whatever it is. Some companies most actually have got a sort of a limit that they probably won't, if it's one off and it's 1 week, we're not going to get out of bed for that. The risk is so low, it's not worth it. But if this is part of a, 7 days every quarter, we'll start to add those up. So they give guidance around the number of days, when the reporting is required, and who to report to. And if you're internationally remote permanently, again, probably a little bit easier from a policy perspective because that person's going to be, that's where they are. But the background information on that is what are they doing? Who do they work for? Do we have an entity? Just to finish off that bit of the question you mentioned, some companies I've seen have absolutely reined in, you can only work in these locations. And that is based on, we have a corporate entity in that state, in that country. One client has 12 offices globally. Those are the 12 you could, those are the only 12 countries you could work in. It doesn't mean to say the risk is eliminated because you're still representing your home country in that other location, but there's some coverage because of the local entity. Some have based it on your immigration. You may have dual nationality with another country to make it a little bit easier for immigration purposes. There may be the tax treating network with particular countries that again offer protection because you're there for such a short period potentially. That again, there's protection. So I think those policy points need to be looked at and confirmed. Then the policy goes into who to speak to, and what the reporting is around that, who's responsible for your tax filings, and what the company will do versus what you need to do as an individual. Something's just gone out of my head. Oh, and the responsibility for things like expenses. There's typically, most companies have said from a remote work perspective have said the expenses are on the individual. We're not paying for your Airbnb or hiring the Ferrari or eating at the Michelin star restaurant every night. That's on you, kind of thing. So that's the sort of remote work policy, and what that does is feeds into other elements of the process internally in other departments. Because, for example, somebody going to work in one of those in another country, the corporate tax team might want to know what permanent establishment risk that creates and what they need to say within their sort of statement of practice as such, what they should be looking out for and how to manage that. You may have a expense policy that needs updating to actually explain you can't expense, just remote working, like internet costs. The legal team might want to know about data privacy and duty of care and health, and you're working and you break your leg, who's the medical insurance on? Your laptop stolen and we didn't know you were there. How is all that managed as well? And that's not even reward or tax. I mean, that's very different sort of themes. So that's where I think that core policy around the remote work piece can then sort of link into other policy points to consider as well. What it reminds me of, Sam, is a little bit, do you remember that film with Tom Cruise where he's sort of got the screen and I can't remember what it's called, but he's got that sort of 3D virtual screen. It's a bit like that, but it's not impossible to get through. It's just breaking it down into blocks and then building out the solution. And it's achievable for any scale business. It's just having those discussions.
So basically, and just having we're having listeners that are wondering, it's like, okay, so where do I start? I mean, what are the pieces that I need to start first? And what do you recommend? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. It goes back to that 5-point plan.
Yeah.
5-point plan. Do it that way. No, try and identify the risk first, because it's what I found is that multiple people know that there is a risk, and it's like you don't really want to stick your hand up to be the owner and add on to your day job. So I would have that initial review of where you are at the moment. Is there somebody within your organization already looking at it? If there isn't, get that team of people together. If it might just be a small team to begin with of like-minded, we know we've got risk in those areas I mentioned, and then try and get the data. And it's harder to get than, say, business travel or your regular expats, because this is your total workforce. But you can do things which are, as I say, very proactive and sort of you need to think of your sort of cultural approach to this. Is it an online survey which just says, look, have you worked remotely in 2023, in 2022? Do a historical analysis of your risk. Could be just the last 12 months. It could be the last 24 months. That will identify where you do have risk, and that could be based on certain countries, certain states, certain levels of individuals, certain departments. You can then start to see exactly where your risk areas are, and they become your sort of red alerts to do something and notify and manage that risk. I think once you've established that, then you can start to think about, how do we solve this? And it's policy, going back to those pillars: policy, process, technology with a question mark. Do you have something in already, or do you need to look at something else? And then ultimately, what does that compliance piece look like at the end? Because all that data flows through to somebody somewhere having to action that on behalf of the company, whether that's through payroll reporting. What's your risk tolerance? Is it 10 days you don't care? Is it 5 days? Is it, anyone going for more than 30 days, you have to let us know. You then will be put on a different payroll. It's those sorts of decisions to manage that overall risk. There is another element here, which is categorizing staff as well. And I'm not a great fan of this, because it makes it sound like once you're in one category, that's it, you never move. So you might have someone who's 100% in the office, someone who's 100% remote. We know that people are constantly moving different types, right? So you might have a remote worker who becomes a business traveler. So I think it's helpful to categorize from in the policy, perhaps 100% in the office, hybrid, business traveler, expat, remote, maybe. But I think that they all start to merge. Where I'm going with that is that in itself, you're still looking at the same data, and you're still trying to gather the same data: where they are, how long, what were they doing. And I think that's where I would start. Sorry, that's probably a long answer. I'd start with that group and getting that data to begin with. Long answer, sorry.
Yeah, no, good stuff, David. So I know we're just about to stop the hour, but the last piece I wanted to kind of go through with you is, you mentioned technology, and you do assist with some of those elements. Can you tell us a little bit more about the tech that is emerging and is currently available in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the technology I've seen is basically been involved from that sort of tax, social security, payroll, immigration perspective. So I don't know whether to give names or not. Maybe I will. Why not? So the big four typically. So that would be your Vialto, KPMG, EY, and Deloitte. They have business traveler technology and processes around that. All very good, very sort of driven by the data going in, etc. there are some alternatives, and the advantage of that sort of thing is that obviously it feeds into, if you already use them as your provider, there's an argument that of course that helps with the data flowing through to that sort of back end process, and the other sort of technical aspects around that. There are other standalone technologies, and I'm probably going to do a disservice to people, but good ones I've seen are Tracker, which is an ECA international TST Tracker technologies. No, Tracker Software Technologies. They're very good. They're an independent technology provider, and they work with you and your providers in those different areas. Immigration businesses have their own immigration proprietary technology as well. What they're doing is they're essentially taking data from various sources, or getting the individual employee to plug in what they're doing. It's all integrated through sort of cloud and APIs, and it's basically designed to drive a much more automated process. And then at the end, you're getting the actions that come out. From a remote work perspective, it's sort of more of a corporate and individual basis. Work from anywhere, that's a good bit of software. That's in conjunction with Mercer as well. That's a really good piece of proprietary technology. So all these together offer slightly different variations, and that's why it's worth just considering which one is the best for your needs and your budget, and what you actually want it to do at the back end. There are more, and I'm sure I'm going to get hate mail now for not mentioning at least 4 or 5 others. So apologies to others. I'm sure there's a few out there.
So what are the next step for our listeners if they want to get some additional help or advice on this? How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, there's my website, which is I spent ages trying to come up with a name for my company, so it's Livitt and Associates. There you go, livittandassociates.com. There's a section there. You can send me a message. Emails david@livittassociates.com. I think really how I would finish this off would be, assess your risk right now. Where are you? Where do you want to be? Do you want to be right at the front of the pack, or do you want to just be doing something so that there's, should that risk arise, what it is and you can act upon that. And then I would very firmly, whether it's, you're a startup or a more, a larger organization, think about that communication piece, and again, refresh it, just remind people of what their obligations are, or look to establish what they should be. And then just really think about your risk and compliance. It's the data at the start, which is really important before we get into all that other stuff. But that data, certainly from the reward space, what are you reporting and where? Certainly when you get some of those longer term incentives, that's where the complexity is. So I think those are the sort of 3 areas I would say. Assess where you are right now, get some communications out, and know what you need to do.
Great. Well, thanks, David. This has been really helpful. I really appreciate this discussion. It was a lot of good information.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I know it's, I'm quite passionate about it. I find it really interesting because it's quite complex, but you can solve it. It's not unsolvable. So
no, you provided a great framework for companies to think about.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Great.
Well, thank you once again, and we'll see everybody else next month on the Rewards Mastermind.
Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.